Hello, John.
Hi there.
So we've just finished recording you reading your piece about how you got it wrong on Corbyn for our Double Take podcast, which is our new podcast from Independent Voices. So thank you for reading it out.
It was a painful experience.
How do you feel after the election on an emotional level?
An emotional level? No, I'm annoyed with myself because, I should have been more aware of uncertainty. This is always the problem, is that especially me, I'm obsessed with opinion polls, as you know. I'm obsessed with numbers. They're the only kind of hard information you have during an election. And obviously I end up putting too much weight on them and not really looking for an evidence that, they might be wrong. It was difficult because there wasn't really any evidence suggesting that, there was going to be a hung parliament. But people did tend to assume that if the polls were wrong, then it was going to be in the direction of the Tories getting an even bigger majority than the polls suggested.
Because that was the traditional sort of orthodoxy around polling, is that, like you say in your piece, that people overstate voting Labour, when in this case it wasn't at all.
No, that's right. I mean, the polls didn't overstate Labour in 2010 and they didn't overstate Labour in 1983, but those are the only two examples of recent modern elections where they didn't. And I didn't think that this election felt like either of those. So, there you go. But, I'll know next time.
And polls is one thing, but also another thing you mentioned in the piece that you wrote for us was underestimating the Corbyn appeal. And I think today's quite timely because you did a tweet today, John, that I'm going to read out. So today you tweeted, 10 years ago today, the skies darkened and the country has been grey and miserable ever since. Tony Blair stood down as PM 27th of June 2007. So do you still feel like Corbyn isn't the man and a sort of Blair 2.0 is what Labour needs?
No, I don't. I'm not. I mean, I was obviously being ironic in that tweet. I mean, I thought that, Tony Blair was on balance a good prime minister. And it really infuriates me that the entire Corbyn movement seems to be built on Blair hatred. And, this seems to be completely unreasonable for, a prime minister who actually made this country better on balance. I mean, he had all sorts of flaws. But to build an entire movement in reaction to, what ought to be, I think, one of Labour's proudest periods in government, seems to me just completely misconceived and wrong. And that is part of my emotional difficulty in coming to terms with Corbynism.
This is something I find quite interesting about you and I, because we both write on Labour quite a lot. And in many ways, we're quite representative of our demographics. I write pro-Corbyn pieces and I'm fully in support and part of that movement.
Yeah.
And for something for you that's, like you say, it's opposed to this Blair, this leader who you thought actually did great things for the country. But I wonder if that's got something to do with the different sort of context in which we grew up. So like I grew up in a sort of post-Blair, or came to like political awakening post-Blair, post-Iraq.
Yeah.
When marketisation began to sort of like take form and then took further form under Cameron. Whereas maybe for you, do you feel like 1983 and the Foot defeat shaped how you see Labour?
Yeah. I mean, my entire political formation was built in, the late 70s, early 80s, when the Labour Party I thought was completely off track. And the 1983 election was very significant for me. That was when the party put forward a programme which is very similar to a lot of the things that Jeremy Corbyn's doing now, and was completely destroyed by a successful Conservative government. And so, from that point, I've always thought that the Labour Party ought to be in the centre ground and ought to form that kind of government, a centrist Labour government, and that's the kind of government that I want to see. And I think, all my disagreements with Jeremy Corbyn are because he's trying to take the party away from that.
So I think it was today, or quite recently, the most recent stat from YouGov said that 43% of the British public agree that a socialist government would make Britain a better place. Do you think there's been a,
well, we had a socialist government in 1997 to 2010. But the problem is,
I
think
might disagree
people,
with that. Maybe.
Well, this is precisely the problem. People have an idea in their heads about what socialism means. As far as I'm concerned, Tony Blair was a democratic socialist prime minister and a relatively successful one. And he did good egalitarian things. And my frustration with Jeremy Corbyn is that wasn't a particularly egalitarian manifesto that he fought on. And unlike you, I actually agree with Jeremy Corbyn on one big thing, which is that he accepts Brexit. He accepts that we're leaving the European Union. And all those people who were cheering him and singing, "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn."
I said I'd give you a 5 if you said it. There you go.
All those people singing that ridiculous football chant at Glastonbury, they don't agree with Brexit. And yet they're cheering this guy who, I think is right to accept Brexit.
Oh, I don't know. I think a lot of people have come to accept Brexit now. I think that's a sort of conversation which, for the most part, has been put to bed. But what I am interested in discussing is this idea of socialism. So what do you think is less socialist about Corbyn compared to Blair?
Well, because he wasn't proposing to do anything about reversing the cuts to working tax credits for the working poor, which are still in the government plans, and there was nothing about that in the Labour manifesto. Instead, there was this huge subsidy to middle class graduates in the form of £11 billion a year to abolish tuition fees. And that's a lovely idea, and I'm in favour of it in principle, but it's the wrong priority if you're spending that kind of money. I think. To spend it on people who are going to be mostly better off as a result of going to university.
So you see universalism, as it were, as a not very socialist.
Well, it's not particularly. No, I mean it's a nice idea, and obviously, I've been in favour of child benefit, and universal benefits are better than means tested benefits. Absolutely, everybody accepts that. But in practice, you've got limited amount of money as a government, and you need to spend it more wisely.
So this is, maybe I'll make this my last question, because it's quite a big one. So it's this idea of the economy being a sort of household economy. You borrow and you have to repay back, and you have less in your purse. Whereas what I think a lot of people who are behind Corbynomics would say is that actually that's like microeconomics. Macroeconomics is you have lots of different pots of money that you're moving around at any given time.
Yeah.
So do you think that critique still stands when you look at it from that point of view, from infrastructure spending, actually giving people more money to spend in the future when they've got a better job because they've had a better degree?
Yeah, no, obviously, as a government, you can borrow money, and especially at the moment, you can borrow money quite cheaply. I mean, there's a good Keynesian argument for the government to do that. Although at this stage in the business cycle, when we're now quite a long way from a recession, nearly 10 years out of the financial crash, the government shouldn't actually be borrowing huge amounts of money because interest rates do have to go back up to normal levels at some point. I'm not an economic expert, but I do know, and you don't want to make simplistic analogies, but I do know that governments that just borrow as if there's no tomorrow do get into trouble, because I was alive in the 1970s when that Labour government tried to do that, and it was James Callaghan who said, in the end, you can't just sort of borrow your way out of trouble. And in the end, the government does have to balance its books. It doesn't have to balance them, in the strict sense which I know you lot call austerity, which I think is just a slogan. A government can borrow a certain amount as long as it doesn't increase the national debt as a percentage of the GDP. But there are limits, and you can't just solve all problems by going to the magic money tree.
Unless you're the DUP.
Well, that's a very small, as one Conservative MP was quoted, that's a very small bonsai tree.
Well, thank you for joining us, John. So you're sorry, but not sorry to Corbyn.
Well, I'm not sorry at all. I'm annoyed with myself for having underestimated his popularity, but it doesn't mean that I agree with anything Jeremy Corbyn stands for, except Brexit.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
My pleasure.